But I have a little formula that I follow, Jefferson, when I have folks like yourself on the show, because I'm intrigued always by the genesis of someone's, I'll call it someone's civic patriotism. The willingness of someone like yourself, who you're a graduate of the New York University, you went to the New England School of Law, you've got your own practice, you've got your own family, you've got all sorts of challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis, both for yourself and on behalf of your clients. What, in your case, was the genesis, the birth of your decision to get involved in civil liberties?
Well, I grew up in a family in Brooklyn, New York that was very involved in civil liberties and civil rights issues, so I really grew up with it. Once I graduated from NYU, I became a teacher, and I taught for 10 years, but was very active in social service work and union work, and decided that I wanted to be an advocate for a living as to instead of just as a volunteer. And I went to law school and got my law degree and got licensed to practice law, and have now been doing it for 33 years and find it very challenging and interesting.
Now, first off, I got to ask you, what part of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
I was born in Brooklyn Hospital and lived on Brooklyn Heights, and for about 11 years, and then in Crown Heights, and then in Boerum Hill.
Wow, okay.
In the downtown section.
My roots are in Brooklyn as well. My mom actually went to nursing school at the Brooklyn Hospital School of Nursing, which was essentially became part of Brooklyn College. All right, so that's where the tenacity comes from. Brooklyn kids, sorry folks, folks from the Providence think you're tough. Nah, pale imitation. Describe your practice. What type of work do you typically do when you're not advocating on behalf of individual rights?
Well, right now I'm a solo practitioner. I do a lot of family court work. I do some criminal defense work. I do some probate work. I do some special education work in the schools.
Wow, okay.
So I have a nice varied practice.
Wow, okay.
And I've mentored 3 or 4 different attorneys over the years who have worked with me, but right now I'm solo.
And where can folks find your practice on the web?
Well, I am not a technical person. All of my practice is word of mouth. I am in the phone book. But I get a lot of work through the lawyer referral service and word of mouth. And many of my clients go back generations.
Right.
I have grandparents who are sending their children or their grandchildren to me. So I stay busy.
I'm sure you do. How long have you been working as we like to say, as a cooperating attorney with the ACLU?
I took my first case in the late 80s.
Wow.
I represented a woman who lost her position as a constable because in the city of East Providence, her sister ran for political office, and we alleged that it was retaliation, and that was one of my first challenging cases, which went to trial. And the decision was affirmed, and we were successful in getting her back pay and vindication.
What are generally speaking? What are some other cases that you've run on?
Well, the case that I'm handling right now really goes back to 1991. When the town of Narragansett first tried to exclude URI students from living in town. And at that point, they passed an ordinance saying that no more than 3 unrelated people could live together in the town of Narragansett. And we litigated that case for 2 years and successfully got a ruling from the Superior Court in Washington County that the ordinance was unconstitutional.
Right.
And that case has continued. The town now in 2016, tried again.
Mm-hmm.
They modified the ordinance to make it no more than 4 unrelated people rather than 3 unrelated people.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, it was the same effort to prevent landlords and tenants from providing affordable housing for URI students and for others in the town of Narragansett.
Now, I got
I also was involved in the orange sticker case.
Okay, right.
It was another attempt by the town of Narragansett to shame URI students in
Mm-hmm.
terms of their behavior in town. And that was not successful, but that was a fight that's been an ongoing fight.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask, and again, as I like to say, I'm not an expert. I literally try to play one on the radio. And again, I'm not here to cast aspersions or to try to demonize any municipal employee. And by the way, all my thoughts, my questions are my own and are not a reflection of our guests. But what is it that would make an individual running a town think that it was okay to say 4 people who don't know each other can't live together? There are a range of issues before attorneys like yourself that are nuanced. And and we're going to get into some of the legal issues in a second. And that is not for me at all to try and diminish the sophistication of the response that you have to provide as a cooperating attorney for the ACLU in a courtroom environment. But these ordinances meant that at some point in time, particularly post the first decision, as you said, that was in 1991, a group of ostensibly intelligent, articulate adults somehow thought that this was a good idea. I don't know a more polite way that I can phrase it. But when you were going through these proceedings, because this has been going on as long as I've lived in the state, and I understand that in cases like the east side of Providence, over on the west end by PC, in an area that's directly adjacent to a major state university, I understand that living with, in and around college students can be a challenge. And I say that with a great deal of empathy. I mean, we're talking about young people who make questionable decisions, very often directly adjacent to folks who have lived in communities, in some cases for generations. But I would imagine part of the litigation and the process that you've gone through over all these years with this was the underlying reasoning when the town council voted on this. So in 2016, clearly these folks have an institutional memory. Was there anything that they constructed differently in the legislation from 1991, or did they simply think that somehow going from 3 to 4 people would make it okay? I'm confused. Help me out here.
Well, in 1994, there was a new enabling statute issued by the General Assembly, and there was slightly different wording in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the town council members, with their advice under their solicitor, thought that if they mimicked that language, maybe they could get the ordinance switched. They did move it up to no more than 4 unrelated people in hopes that that might dampen any opposition to the ordinance, but clearly it was still an arbitrary ordinance that violated due process and equal protection rights, and still should not and does not pass constitutional muster. But there's always political pressure in a town,
Mm-hmm.
and not all college students have the best behavior,
Right.
but there are other ordinances to deal with those issues. So unfortunately, they had a lot of political pressure from some neighborhood groups, and people organized and convinced the town council that they had to act and they had to try again.
Mm-hmm.
And so they ended up sending out summonses to 34 different landlords
Mm-hmm.
this time around. And I represented 31 of them, and John Kenyon represented 3 of the individuals. And we decided that we would challenge this before the municipal court, and we filed motions to dismiss all of these criminal or quasi-criminal petitions that were filed against these landlords.
Mm-hmm.
The old case back in 1991-92, the town at that point had gone after tenants as well as landlords. But this time, the emphasis was just going after landlords, trying to demonize landlords.
What was the
So-
what if the conviction for these landlords was held? What would the penalties have been to them?
The penalty for violating this ordinance was $500 per day.
Yikes!
And these summonses, my first clients received summonses back in September of 2016, others in October of 2016, and right up through March of 2017. Various clients of mine received summonses. So yes, the penalties would have been quite draconian
Right,
if we hadn't been successful.
potentially bankrupting these folks. What was the reporting mechanism? I mean, was there a little website, www.dropadimeonalandlord.com? I mean, how did I'm always astonished too by the efforts municipalities, particularly local small town governments, will engage in to, and my term, not yours, go on this type of witch hunt in order to essentially justify, again, my words, their crazy laws. So how do these? I mean, do you have to file a form with the town as to how many people are living in your house, or I mean, how do they get? Who narked on them?
Well, initially, I think it was neighbors complaining to the town building officials
Mm-hmm.
And making complaints, which started the process.
Mm-hmm.
But Narragansett also has another ordinance where all landlords have to register, and they have to pay I believe it's $85 per building. They have to list the number of tenants they have, and so the town is trying to collect data on everybody and then use that to prosecute landlords who had 5 or 6 tenants.
So
And many of these houses are 5 and 6 bedroom houses,
right.
and the landlords have been renting for 10 or 20 or 30 years to that number of students.
Now, let me ask you a question. Filling out these forms, do you fill these forms out under penalty of perjury?
Well, I believe so. And they want a copy of everybody's lease.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, so it's that's why it was so important to challenge this, because
Mhm.
it's really overreach by the government, violating privacy rights in addition to other rights of the tenants and the landlords.
Wow. All right. So now, and full disclosure, I'm the chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. It's always been my contention that when government gets information, bad things happen. And I'll point out, as I did in our first segment, to what happened with the state's prescription medical database. You now have the specter of warrantless searches by simply the request of law enforcement. Now, and forgive my rhetoric, my hyperbole here, but how far removed is this from, can I see your papers, please? And particularly after this week, that can be construed by some of us to be highly charged offensive language. But again, how far are we from, can I see your papers, please? I mean, whose damn business it is who you rent to?
Well, That's right. I mean, the town does have an obligation to make sure that buildings are safe, and that there are minimal codes.
Right.
But if you have a building permit, you build a 6-bedroom house, and you should have the right to rent to 6 people.
Right, because
I can understand some kind of rational system where you can't have 100 people living in a 2-bedroom house. So some minimal regulation for health and safety reasons is appropriate.
Absolutely.
But this is way overreach and not really related to health and safety.
Right, because the difference is, in one case, you're looking to septic issues, overcrowding, fire safety, things like that. In another case, you're looking to the nature of the personal relationships between the people who are living there, and clearly targeting a specific class. Which, by the way, I always find deep dark irony when people in Providence or North Kingstown or at any university complain about the presence of a college, when in fact there is so much that those universities and colleges do to add to the quality of life, and quite honestly, often to the value of the property holdings of the people who live there. So this,
absolutely.
So you've got this dichotomy where you've got, on one hand, the Kingston area being the clear beneficiary of the presence, if you will, of the University of Rhode Island, the type of people it attracts, international scholars, athletes, some cases scam artists building buildings for international scholars and athletes. Sorry about that unfortunate juxtaposition there, but you've got this town council which clearly thinks it has free reign to run their own little fiefdom there, their own little nation. I'll ask you the same question I asked Attorney Lyons. At this point in the state, from your experience as someone who's practiced law here for literally a generation, do we need some sort of constitutional intervention here? Should we gather up all the town councilmen and make them get a permit for being town councilmen or women and make them attend, I don't know. You have to take a driver's test to operate a motor vehicle. I would argue at this point, listening to some of the madness that's gone on in the state, particularly in the last few months, that you should have a license and pass a constitutional test before you're allowed to be a town council person. Yikes! Is it something? Is it something in the water?
Clearly there needs to be education and civic education, and that's one of the reasons the ACLU is so involved in these cases, is to try to educate the public as to constitutional rights, both under the U.S. Constitution and the Rhode Island Constitution. And we need to constantly be educating people and learning about the rights in a democracy, rights and responsibilities in a democracy. So hopefully with education and with a free press that publicizes these activities of government, we can make sure that the constitutions are followed and that there's a respect for the rights, the equal protection and due process rights of our citizens.
Folks, if you're just joining me on the line remotely, H. Jefferson Melish. He is an attorney practicing in Wakefield, Rhode Island, with a general practice of law, with a number of interesting environments, but he's also a cooperating attorney of longstanding with the Rhode Island chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. This segment is in fact sponsored by Beacon Shipping and Logistics. Again, you'll find links all over our websites and our posts. But needless to say, whether you're listening locally here in Rhode Island or nationally, if you need to move a vehicle, and we're coming up to that time of year when folks need to get their car out to their kiddo in college somewhere, or perhaps a family member who is no longer driving is passing a vehicle down, they provide safe, affordable, effective vehicle transportation. They're based right here in Warwick, Rhode Island, so it's a local touch, but they truly have international reach. I've used them a number of times on a professional basis and found them to be the very best. So that's Beacon Shipping and Logistics. And again, kudos to folks who are willing to extend themselves and support independent media. Attorney Melish has pointed out that a free and active media is necessary to really report on and discuss situations like the type that he's involved in down in the Narragansett and North Kingstown area. One can argue that in many cases our local media, the institutional media if you will, is failing to really dive into these cases, these situations, these issues with the intensity and the breadth that are so necessary in a free society. That's why we're here. That's why organizations like Motif, Rhode Island Free Radio, RI Future exist, to do the hard work that it would appear in some cases maybe big national centralized media doesn't quite get it. But joining me on the line again here at the Coalition Radio, H. Jefferson Melish, we're talking about the realities of practicing law on behalf of the ACLU here in Rhode Island, as well as it seems like the never-ending vigilance necessary to be performed on town governments. Now, you know, we spoke extensively about the potential costs of the litigation here. Please feel free, if this is not public record, that's fine. But I mean, in a situation like this, what could a town who lost a case like this expect to have to incur in the form of legal fees and expenses?
Well, at this point, they have a town solicitor who they obviously pay a salary to. Mm-hmm. And so their costs would be paying for his staff, and that's their major cost now. I hope they will not appeal this decision, but that remains to be seen. The decision was just rendered this past week, so we don't know if they're going to challenge the decision or not.
Mm-hmm. Now, while you find this practice clearly to be rewarding, at the same time, this takes you away from your professional practice, doesn't it?
It does.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it absolutely does. But I do serve on the Rhode Island ACLU Board of Directors and on the executive committee of it, and I'm fully committed to the work of enhancing and fighting for civil liberties and civil rights of all of us. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to participate. Sometimes there are fee-generating cases if they are brought in federal court pursuant to civil rights laws. So sometimes you can get fees in a successful case, and that does help fund the ACLU, and very generous people help fund the ACLU to make our work available to protect everyone.
What would Rhode Island be like without the ACLU?
Well, I think the ACLU is such an important, integral part of the justice system. There are many good lawyers who fight very hard for their clients' constitutional rights and civil rights, but there would be a big hole. The defense lawyers do a fabulous job protecting people's constitutional rights when they're accused of crime. There are public interests, the legal services, Disability Law Center, Dorcas International. There are many organizations that help find lawyers, but the ACLU for 75 years or so has just done an outstanding job, and usually is handling anywhere from 30 to 40 cases at any particular time.
Right.
So there are 30 or 40 dedicated cooperating attorneys, and I think all of us do play a very important role, and we appreciate all the support that we do receive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's simple enough to join. Again, we'll provide links online for folks to join. And it's literally, I believe it's about, when I paid my dues last year, it's about $25 a year to join. It's something nominal like that. but that gives them a baseline of support that they need to advocate against, well, overreaching government. You know, as Rhode Islanders, it's quite fashionable at this point, given what's going on with the tolls, which we'll cover later in this show, what's going on with 38 Studios, 38 Stadium, all the corporate giveaways. It's quite fashionable to whine and complain about that. Anyone can go on social media and use that as a forum to protest. But ultimately, let's be blunt, that has very little practical effect on the day-to-day lives of average Rhode Islanders. Unfortunately, in this world, folks don't do things because they're simply the right thing to do. Very often, folks have to be sued. I can think of no other organization that, on such a broad level, and you mentioned several fabulous groups, Dorcas, the Disability Law Center, we had them on the show about a year and a half ago. All of these folks do yeoman's work in protecting the rights of the individual. But I can think of no other organization, locally or nationally, that takes such a broad perspective on the work that's needed to prevent government from literally in the middle of the night, taking away your civil liberties. What happens, Attorney Melish, when people just, what's the most overused line in the book? If you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. Is there truth in that statement?
No. Many innocent people get charged with crimes. Many people can be affected by police policies, by government policies. Right now, with all of the emphasis from the federal government against undocumented peoples, causing tremendous difficulties for many people in Rhode Island, people who are victims of crime or witnesses of crime who are afraid to cooperate with the police. There are just so many people who have done nothing wrong but who can be affected by government overreach. So I think but for the grace of God go I, it can happen to any of us.
Because
so I think we
look,
do have to be vigilant and aware and stay publicly involved.
So if, getting back to your situation, and folks, if you're just joining us, H. Jefferson Melish was successful in prosecuting, if you will, a law promoted by a municipality in Rhode Island that would have made it a finable offense to have more than 4 unrelated people living in the same domicile. That same municipality requires a pretty strenuous list of paperwork to be filed on behalf of essentially the profiles of the people living in Sydney. And under that same law, we're quite willing to fine people to the tune of $500 a day. Now, if that was a civil fine, was it not?
Well, I call it a quasi-criminal fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a large amount that, and the complaints that were brought against my clients all were on criminal forms.
Yikes.
So I believe that it's at least quasi-criminal, if not a criminal ordinance.
Right. And then clearly the inability or the failure to pay those fines would lead to potentially life-altering circumstances and or criminal prosecution. Is that correct?
Well, we're challenging the enforceability of that ordinance, and clearly the municipal court judge agreed that that ordinance is unconstitutional on its face and has applied to these defendants. So the law is still on the books, but it is not enforceable based on this court ruling.
Excellent.
So
now,
that does protect these people. and protects all of the landlords in Narragansett.
Right. Do you feel like, by the way, and what's interesting to me is the juxtaposition of where we are as a society in terms of our civil liberties and where we were at the nation's founding. Onerous taxes, indiscriminate fines. There are those who argue that we now live under the very same circumstances, particularly if the ACLU were to be absent from the landscape, that we live under the same circumstances that caused our great-great-great-great-grandfathers to rebel against England in the 18th century. Do you give that any credence? I mean, has government gotten to the point where essentially we've replaced King George with a nameless, faceless, shapeless federal bureaucracy?
Well, I would not go that far. I think we still have a democracy that we can save and work with and work within. So I am not giving up hope on the American ideal and on the constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights, the Rhode Island Constitution. We still have a free press. We still have an independent judiciary. We still have the right to elect people.
Right.
We just need to elect people who understand the rights of people and respect the rights of people. So I think we need to stay engaged. I don't think we should give up. So I'm going to continue to do what I can as long as I'm able to.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for dialing in tonight. I know that you've got a very hectic schedule this week, so I appreciate you taking the time. As and more importantly, I appreciate your efforts both in being on the board of the ACLU as well as actively litigating on behalf of the citizens of Rhode Island. In this case, in your successful suit against Narragansett, we were talking about individual property owners, many of whom regular folks, who held property in their family, in some cases for generations, who I believe were, in the case proved, were singled out in clearly an unconstitutional method to accomplish some type of social, I guess, the altering of a social behavior. As in so many of these cases, and I believe this was part and parcel of your success, there are individual laws that exist that directly address the behavior which makes those situations, those living situations, potentially onerous. So I would just ask that if at some point in time a city council person or a mayor or a town solicitor comes across this conversation, focus on enforcing legitimate laws which prevent an individual from harming their community. Don't try to engage in this extra-constitutional behavior where you create databases of private information about people that you then use to enforce your own often arbitrary standards and then attach large civil fines to which the individual, in the absence of the ACLU, has so little chance of defeating at any level, which can negatively impact so many lives. That's my recommendation out of this. But again, Attorney Melish, thank you for your service to the community, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. Have a good evening.
Thank you, sir. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. You are, in fact, listening to the Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, broadcasting live at the Go Local Live Broadcasting Center here in the city we love, 90 Way Boston Street. Of course, we refer to Providence as the Naked City, the city of 1,000 stories. You've heard a couple of them tonight. Activist lawyers who, following the mantra, unknowingly of course, of the coalition, of people who clearly, at a very high level, take it very, very personally. These are folks who have invested years in education, in building a sophisticated legal practice, who are willing to, on their own dime, on their own time, with no guarantee of compensation or even basic fundamental reimbursement of their expenses, who advocate for all of you. Tonight we heard about a compelling, a tragic situation in which yet another community felt it was entirely appropriate to essentially abscond with a gun owned by a deceased individual, that it was okay for them to do this despite existing case law, existing precedent to the contrary. Then we hear about, 35 years post, an original decision, a municipal government with minor alterations attempting to impose thousands of dollars in fines on ordinary businessmen and women who have, in some cases, multi-generational family investments in real estate for the unpardonable act of having 3 or 4 or 5 people live together who weren't family because of either the town and municipality's laziness enforcing existing laws, which are already on the books, which can address antisocial behavior that creates an environment of harm or fear to the community. They felt the need, my words, not my guess, to engage in sort of a municipal form of outrage porn. Let's pass a really bad law. Let's not consider the consequences that will occur as a result of its passage and ultimately its enforcement. Let's ignore the precedent that exists beforehand, and let's run like hell to create more bad legislation in this state. Really? In the year of the internet, 2017, where folks can clearly take the time to see if, I don't know, folks have been there before. Across this state, we continue to engage, whether it be in prayer banners, whether it be in jaywalking bans, whether it be in medical cannabis, whether it be in arbitrary laws challenging the employability of folks who are using properly prescribed medical cannabis, on and on and on. Cities, towns, municipalities that have significant challenges fiscally, structurally, philosophically, choose instead to dive into these areas, I believe, for short-term political gain. Nothing else. Ignoring instead the hard work necessary to really, fix the problem. We'll continue to cover these, and we'll also continue to cover the heroic efforts of these citizen advocates, these attorneys who are willing to donate their time in conjunction with the American Civil Liberties Union in advocating for yours and my rights. Even if our particular circumstances we have not had our rights abridged, even if we are not the victim of an overreaching government, they exist to protect all of us. And I think we've proven tonight, as I would say in court, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in the absence of those laws, we would be a far poorer society on many, many levels.